The Battle of El Alamein took place in Egypt, 66 miles west of the city of Alexandria. The battle started at 9:40 p.m. on Friday, October 23, 1942, when British forces and its allies launched a 4-hour ground and air bombardment. The battle ended on November 4, 1942, with the German troops retreating and the Allied forces declaring a major victory. The major combatants were the German and Italian armies fighting against the British Imperial forces composed by Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, South Africans, Americans, and some French and Greek units. The German and Italian forces led by General Rommel included 500 aircrafts, 500 tanks, 500 artillery guns, and 100,000 soldiers. The Allied forces led by General Montgomery were composed of 900 aircrafts, 1,000 tanks, 800 artillery guns, and 200,000 men. The battle lasted approximately 10 days. The German and Italian forces, short on fuel and supplies, could not match the Allied air and troop superiority. On November 4, 1942, the battle was over. To avoid complete annihilation, Rommel had no other choice but to withdraw from the war and retreat into Tunisia. Field Marshal Montgomery was the commanding officer for the British and Allied forces. Nicknamed Monty, he was a senior British Army general that fought in World War II and World War I. During World War II, he was the commander of the British 8th Army and in charge of the Western Desert Campaign until the final Allied victory in Tunisia in May 1943. After he successfully completed the campaign in Africa, he led the 8th Army during the Allied invasion of Sicily and Operation Overlord, the invasion of Normandy. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel was the commanding officer for the German troops. Rommel was a highly decorated officer that fought in World War I. In World War II, he distinguished himself as the commander of the 7th Panzer Division during the 1940 invasion of France. His leadership and skills demonstrated during the North Africa campaign established his reputation as one of the most able tank commanders of the war, and earned himself the nickname of the Desert Fox. He later commanded the German forces fighting the Allies in the invasion of Normandy in June 1944. At the end of the battle, the German and Italian forces suffered 9,000 casualties. 15,000 soldiers were wounded and 35,000 were taken prisoner. They also lost 500 tanks, 254 guns, 64 German and 20 Italian aircrafts. The Allied forces suffered almost 5,000 casualties and 9,000 men were wounded. Almost 500 tanks were destroyed and 77 British and 20 American aircrafts were lost. Tanks. He planned his attack in 2 phases. The first, Operation Lightfoot, would consist of a powerful artillery bombardment that followed by an attack of infantry divisions in the north and in the south. They would open paths in the German minefield through which the armored divisions would pass. On the night of November 1st, Montgomery launched the second phase of his attack, Operation Supercharge. The second phase was assigned to break through the last part of the German defenses. The infantry units cleared the way for armored divisions. The Battle of El Alamein was the first major victory of the Allied forces against Germany. It proved that the enemy was not invincible. As Winston Churchill described it, it was a glorious and decisive victory. The victory not only boosted the morale of the Allies, it also shifted the momentum in the Allies' favor. With Germany retreating to Tunisia, the Allies gained total control of Egypt and a few months later would permanently evict German troops from Africa. Controlling North Africa also meant controlling the Mediterranean, the Suez Canal, and the oil supplies in the Middle East. This battle represents the turning point in the war in Africa, as well as the one on the European front. With a majority of the German troops fighting on the Russian front, the Allies would launch the invasion of Sicily in July in 1943 that would eventually lead to the invasion of Normandy and
The Battle of Tobruk took place from April to November of 1941. General Erwin Rommel led the German forces to capture Tobruk. This took place in eastern Libya. The Australians from the Allies and the Germans from the Axis were the major combatants in this war. The Allies were on their way to Tobruk when the Germans stopped them and the Allies had to retreat. The Germans surrounded Tobruk and made an attack on the city. In the defense, there was mostly Australian troops fighting and mostly German troops fighting. The Australians were helped by the Royal Navy, which they brought supplies, news from the outside world, and took the wounded out of the city. The Germans were an unstoppable force that nobody could beat. The Australians kept strong as they fought for 8 long months with only the Navy helping in the water. General Rommel thought that they would retreat after the first attack, but the Australians kept it together. The warfare was similar on both sides. They both had tanks, machine guns, and field guns. During the battle, the Nazi propaganda radio broadcasts would refer to the Australians as rats, and they proudly kept that name. After fighting for all those months, the Germans retreated after the British came and took over Tobruk. The Australians lost 832 men and 2,177 were wounded. Then, in June of 1942, Rommel regrouped and were able to push the British across the desert and seize Tobruk. The significance of this battle is that the Axis forces were able to conquer the best naval outpost in North Africa.